Hello everyone, I'm here to give you a very important PSA. Preserve your home videos before it's too late. And we'll get into that in a second, but I know I'm supposed to introduce myself, so let's rewind a bit and do that first. My name is Andrew Czudak. I've worked professionally in video post-production for over a decade now, mostly doing motion graphics and video editing, but dabbling in other areas as well, including video digitization. I was even the closest thing to IT at my old office. As anyone who works in a small company knows, many hats are often worn. But we're getting off track. Let's get back to the topic at hand. We're on a time limit, and I'm not just talking about the 20 minutes I have here to present. I'm guessing a lot of you still have home movies on some form of tape. I know I do. VHS, Betamax, Mini DV, VHS-C, High 8, D8, HDV, there's too many to keep track of. But they all have one thing in common. They're deteriorating. Relatable, am I right? But before we get into why it's happening, I'd like to give you a quick 101 on how tapes work. I'd like to. But the truth is, I barely understand it myself, and I'm sure we can all agree that someone who barely understands something is not really qualified to teach it to others. So instead, I'm just going to say that it involves magnets, metal dust, and analog waveforms. Basically, magic. Great, so I haven't ruined the magic of analog video for anybody. But let's get back to the bad news. The magic spell doesn't last forever, and the wizard is getting old. So let's take your average VHS tape. What's the projected lifespan on this thing? According to Googling around a bit, past the first page even, the answer is roughly 10 to 25 years before you start to see noticeable deterioration. Anything beyond that, and both the likelihood and seriousness of that deterioration starts to ramp up. Here I am at 2 weeks old. I'll be 35 next month. So already, this tape is a decade past our 25-year marker. But my oldest family VHS tape is from before I was born. What could my parents have possibly wanted to record before I came into their lives? The dog, of course. And here's my dog from the other day. Some things never change, huh? Anyway, I successfully digitized all my home movies back in 2017. But even 7 years ago, I was lucky that they transferred as well as they did. Why? Because if we go back to that part about average lifespans, and we look a little closer, we'll notice a little asterisk on that 25 that says, depending on storage conditions. That's right, even if the tapes are basically unused, the place that they've been sitting for the last few decades also affects their lifespan. Put them in the attic? Not ideal. Big temperature swings and dryness can weaken the tapes. Okay, what about the basement? Well, if it's humid down there, you might get mold, and that's not the kind of life these tapes are supposed to contain within them. No, just like me, tapes like to be in comfortable, climate-controlled environments out of direct sunlight. Okay, I know that last one makes me sound a little bit like Batman, but you get what I mean. I like to get my natural vitamin D as much as anyone, but constant exposure to those UV rays is just as bad for me as it is for the old tapes. But wait, there's more. Tapes also deteriorate depending on how often they're played. So if you're anything like my family was, you loved watching America's Funniest Home Videos. But this was the pre-internet era, so if there wasn't a rerun airing, you had no choice but to pop your own tapes into the VCR and laugh at your family members instead. So every time I was scrubbing through my home videos hoping to find a clip that I could send to Bob Saget or Tom Bergeron to win $1 million, that was taking life off the tapes too. Sadly, none of our videos were ever that funny. Speaking of money, my dad was always looking to save it, so he always picked up the cheapest tapes he could find. And at this point, you probably know what I'm about to say. Tape quality matters too. Yep, this Sony tape is probably going to stand the test of time a whole lot better than this one from Radio Shack. And while we're here, let's take a closer look at those durations. This tape can last 2, 4, or 6 hours? How the hell does it do that? Formats like VHS let you record in standard play, long play, or extended play. Those last two sacrifice both quality and longevity in order to squeeze more footage into the same amount of tape. So anything recorded in LP or EP is at a higher risk of failure. Fortunately, my aforementioned father was as technology illiterate as he was thrifty. He barely knew how to work that camera. He didn't even know how to change the date on the screen. I mean, come on, Dad, we wouldn't be getting balmy Novembers for another few decades at least. But anyway, it's a good thing that he didn't understand how to use the camera, because if he did, he probably would have picked LP or EP to record in, and then I might have been shit out of luck when I tried to preserve my tapes. Okay, so the bad news is that the best time to digitize your home movies was over a decade ago. What's the good news? The second best time is now. Despite everything I just said, most of these tapes still work, and they deserve a medal for that. And furthermore, when I say deterioration, I don't mean it's unplayable. What I mean is that there's going to be glitches in the footage that aren't supposed to be there. Like what? Color distortion, horizontal lines, shaky footage, dropped audio, that kind of thing. Total failure is possible and will likely exist in at least some small portions of the tapes, but there's almost certainly still footage worth saving. But I need to stress, your tapes are never going to contain better quality footage than they do right now. Time marches on. So what do we do? Well, you've got options. You can try to digitize them yourself, or you can pay someone else to do it. And you might be thinking, how hard could this really be to DIY? This guy doesn't sound too smart, and he was able to do it. And that's absolutely true. But don't forget, I did work at a video production company. I had access to professional equipment and had the knowledge of what to do with these captures once I had them. And just like the quality of the tape itself, the quality of the equipment you use to digitize also matters. Can you find a working VCR and cables at Goodwill and digitize your tapes with one of these $12 capture cards from Amazon? Yes, you can. But I can promise you, even if it works, it's not going to look as good as it could. We're talking inaccurate colors, washed out contrast, blurred details, more noise, that sort of stuff. And that's assuming it even gets the aspect ratio right. And then there's the possibility you'll end up with drifting audio that turns your home movies into this scene from Singing in the Rain. But look, let's be honest. By today's standards, both of these images kind of suck. No technology we have today is going to make these videos look HD. But if that technology improves in the future, having a high-quality copy now is definitely going to help. But if there's one thing I want you to take away from this presentation, it's this. Any capture is better than no capture at all. These are your family memories we're talking about. Happy or sad, funny or not, they're likely the only method of time travel we're ever going to experience. Sure, a lot of that footage is unquestionably bland, but how many other chances am I going to get to see my grandparents alive and hear their voices again? So with that in mind, even connecting a VCR to your TV and pointing a phone at it is better than nothing. In fact, pointing a phone at your TV might actually be better than that $12 dongle. I might actually have to research and experiment with that later. And speaking of research, I'll be honest, learning how to do this isn't that hard. But learning how to do this right, it's time-consuming. Analog digitization is a rabbit hole, and I know just enough to know how much more there is that I don't know. I can't even see enough of this iceberg to know what buzzwords to populate the bottom with. That said, it's important to remember my audience. This is Nerd Nite. We're all nerds here. I'm sure there are those of you who are not only unfazed, but positively invigorated by my warning. So if you're interested in the process, curious about the hardware, wondering how modern technology is being integrated, or you're just looking for a fun DIY project to pick up, then by all means, go for it. I don't have the time to go into detail in this presentation, but feel free to get in touch and I'll happily point you towards that iceberg. But for the rest of you who want nothing to do with that iceberg and just want to preserve your family history, I recommend taking your tapes to a pro, or at the very least, an enthusiast. There's plenty of online services that do this, like Legacy Box or even Kodak. Yeah, that Kodak. They're still around somehow. And while I know Legacy Box has some very tempting holiday deals going on right now, I personally would rather not use an online service. Not because of any quality issue, but because I'd be afraid of losing my tapes in the mail. Don't blame the mailman, though. They're overworked and underpaid. So, are there local options? Yes, there are. And I'd love to provide personal recommendations for small businesses to support, but because I did my home videos myself, and because I severely procrastinated making this presentation, I can't do that in good conscience. So if you can't find a specific business near you, here's what I recommend. Speaking as someone in the industry, I suggest contacting a local video production company to see if they offer the service. If they're anything like the one I worked for, they have a bunch of this hardware sitting around, and digitizing home movies might actually be a good way for them to make a buck or two during a dry spell. And if they don't offer the service, chances are they know someone who does and might even be able to provide you a professional recommendation. As for money, prices vary. Getting this done professionally might not be cheap, but there is good news. Digitized home movies make for excellent Christmas gifts. Ask me how I know. Give out USBs with hours of family footage to all your relatives and you are set for Christmas this year. Or next year, depending on turnaround time. Speaking of USBs, there's one last thing I want to talk about before I get off this soapbox. Where do you put those home movies once they're digitized? Sitting on a hard drive on a shelf? Not great, Average lifespan of a typical hard drive is 3 to 5 years. Okay, what about a flash drive or an SSD? That ought to be safer, but they're still only estimated to hold data for about 10 years depending on the manufacturer. What about DVDs? Well, manufacturers say discs pressed with professional equipment can last from 30 to 100 years, but blank DVDs burned in your typical DVD drive are only expected to hold data for around 25 if you're lucky. And again, that's all dependent on proper storage conditions. So what the hell do we do? Is nowhere safe? Well, no. Nowhere is safe forever. So the answer is to cover your bases. Get them on the hard drive, get them on the flash drive, get them in the cloud, send copies out to your family, diversify. Because in the world of data storage, the rule is as follows. 2 is 1, and 1 is none. So digitize those tapes and back up your data. Thank you.
Go to nerdnite.com to find a Nerd Nite event near you, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for our latest presentation.